Hi, I'm Grace. I'm a member of a system. Grace is not really my real name. I'm a part of a system. Grace is my system's name. I have a name, but I'm ashamed to even say what my name is. And that's actually what I'm going to be talking about today. So, today I'm going to talk about why I'm embarrassed to admit that I'm part of a system and to admit that I have DID. And this is basically referring to in real life and why I'm ashamed to admit that I have DID. And if I'm talking quietly, that's because I actually don't even want any of my neighbors or anyone to hear me, because of reasons I'll get into later, which is that it can actually be extremely dangerous and embarrassing. And you can lose your housing, you can lose your friends, you can lose your job. There's many bad things that can happen when people know that you have DID. So I'm going to start off by saying that I won't be going in detail today about how I was diagnosed in my other video, but I'm going to talk about, I won't be able to talk about all of it because it's been a drain, and also my memory, I have pretty bad memory issues and memory deficits, so I can't always remember everything at once, so I can only remember stuff that happened to me, and not all of it, but I can't remember all the stuff that's happened to other parts of my system, or how they feel particularly, so they'll probably be able to add some details as well, if I'm not the only one available at this point, and then I can make other videos in the future which are those parts explaining. So for me personally, the biggest problem that I faced is shame and embarrassment. So even though I have received my diagnosis as DID, I still don't feel comfortable admitting what's going on with me, which makes it impossible to explain or validate my behavior. So a lot of people feel relief when they get diagnosed with a mental health condition, and that's because they actually have a reason to explain some of their behavior and a solution for the future for how to get better. The problem with DID is that a lot of people don't believe in it. Even medical professionals and mental health professionals and people who are knowledgeable about therapy and psychology in general, a lot of them just don't believe that DID is a thing. And this is because of misinformation of the medical system. This started off years ago, starting in Freud, when he started coming forward and saying, wow, I think that a lot of the issue behind why these children are having mental health conditions manifesting off as physical health conditions, which in those days called hysteria, is because the fact that they're traumatized, they're child abuse victims. And he came out and started to publish this theory, but then the rich parents that were around in the time said, no, we don't want this news getting out, because that will ruin them, obviously. They're the ones who are paying his bills, so therefore parents get the say rather than the children. So what happens now is that Freud cancels this out and instead says, oh no, the children are obsessed with the parents. The children are lying and they just want the adults to be with them. So this allows child abuse to perpetuate forward for many generations. The point of psychology in general is not to protect abuse victims or reveal abusers, but instead to quiet the victims and quietly take care of them so that the truth doesn't come forward and no one knows that, the people in control are actually abusing people, mostly including children, their women, their families, many issues that they're trying to cover up and hide. So for the best benefit of capitalism and the interests of the people at the top, who are the ones who are doing the abusing, it's best to keep things hidden, which includes child abuse. One of the disorders which is caused by child abuse particularly is dissociative identity disorder. What happens with dissociative identity disorder, to be very brief, is that the child can't deal with the pain of having someone close to them or loved to them abusing them in such a creepy way, and they have to block out the memories instead and remember it in a different part. And so that part's basically in charge. Well, sometimes we create a lot of parts. If you have DID, you can create a lot of parts that are in charge of remembering the traumatic memory and helping, and others are in charge of helping that person go forward. Because if you knew everything that happened, you won't be able to go forward. So it helps to have another part that doesn't remember, and that part can keep going and going. For example, that's me. So I particularly don't remember much of the bad memories that I went through, if any at all, but I'm able to remember them through the eyes of another part. And when I feel the feelings and experience them, I feel really sad because I'm extremely sensitive due to being protected my whole life by my other parts and not let to actually feel and have to go through all the memories of trauma. I do remember what has happened to me. I always have, but it's in a kind of removed sense. It's kind of in a removed sense. Like, I don't particularly feel the feelings myself. I only can feel the other parts talking about it and the experiences of our parts and how they feel about what they've been through. So for me in particular, I'm grateful that those other parts have remembered that, because I won't be able to be alive. So it's kind of a bit of a complex way to stop someone from either having to numb out all the pain of what they're feeling, or have to allow them to be normal in their daily life. So another thing that happened was when this disorder came forward, some of the parts will come forward and basically tell the memories of what has happened to them. And it's a sign to clinicians, because it always pops up in traumatized children, that the children has been traumatized. And so it's in the best interest of sexual abusers and child abusers to say, no, this disorder is not real, it's completely made up, because someone who would make up a disorder would also make up sexual abuse to validate that disorder. So it's a very roundabout way of denying the fact that sexual abuse survivors are actually telling the truth about what they've been through. And over again, we can see the results of how trauma survivors, especially of childhood trauma, are treated when they come forward. We can see what is the true agenda of covering up and hiding this specific disorder. And sad to say, there's a lot of therapists and psychologists, even on YouTube, even in the educational realm, that deny the fact that this disorder created and that this disorder is existing. And this basically allows room for abuse to keep happening, because if we say that the abuse never happened, we are covering up for the abusers who did the harm in the first place. And this is why we have so much repeat abusers, for example, pedophiles, that can just keep preying and preying on new victims as the time comes. Because if a disorder is so shameful that the person who has it can't, function and be normal in society, because some people may be able to hide the fact that they have DID, but it's very difficult when you have dissociative identity disorder to continue to function in society and be like a regular person. So many of the victims themselves and people who have this disorder as a way to get through trauma and recover into adulthood, a very difficult thing for them is the ability to communicate. For me, for example, since I'm a little part and I'm dissociated, scared, a bit traumatized, I have trouble keeping my thoughts cohesive, keeping them in order, and this definitely makes people look at me as unreliable. And because I don't share memories from day-to-day events that happen across my parts, I can also then come across as a liar, because I might say, oh, I don't remember this happening because it happened to another part. I genuinely don't have memory of it. How can I say that I do? But in a sense, I often do have to say that I do, because people don't accept the fact that dissociative identity exists. And even if they do, they don't accept the fact that we genuinely can't control all of our parts, and we genuinely don't have a memory of some of the things that our parts have been through or do even on a daily basis. So because of this, it makes it really, really difficult to deal with the symptoms of DID because they're symptoms that we can't explain, and this makes it difficult to hold up employment, have friendships, have social connections. And in this world, it's actually mandatory to have social skills in order to just survive, because people make it so expensive to even live, sleep, drink, have water. And since most people with DID have abusive families and have a history of either child abuse or becoming from a cult background, which happened to me, my family was a member of the Unification Church, or the Moonies, which is a cult that is involved in a lot of very shady stuff. The children that are from those families that have been abused often don't have anyone to turn to. Because the disorder is pathologized, we often give off red flags or creepy signals to other people, and so it makes it very difficult to even reach out or get support. For me, it took me a really long time to even find a therapist who knew what was going on with me, and I've been turned away by multiple therapists in the past, even ones who did know what was going on with me, by saying I was too complex of a case and I needed more help than they'd be willing to give me. But because I had been turned down by countless therapists, probably 100 or less, I guess, but I end up spending so much money of my own money out of pocket because my parents don't want me to get better, recover in therapy, because that would expose the abuse I've been through. So for people who have DID, they're really on their own a lot of the time, unless they're able to find someone else who also has DID or someone who understands the disorder, such as a therapist who's trained in the field. So in a general sense, it's pretty ostracizing to have this disorder. I spend most of my time hiding inside because I know that something could go wrong at any second that could jeopardize my life, my safety, my happiness, my chance at freedom, and I often get in really dangerous situations, and I'm not even able to ask for help because people wouldn't understand why I get in the situations. And when I do ask for help, I'm not able to explain it correctly because of being dissociated, and I'm often even punished for stuff that I've been through that is not my fault, is not in my control, but no one understands why I'm asking what I am or explaining. The way that I explain is so jumbled that it makes it really difficult for me to accept help, reach out, and get the type of help I need. Also, because I have parts that can come on for a long period of time, it makes it really difficult to hold up appointments and stay accountable for stuff like that. So it's pretty much impossible to maintain a relationship unless someone has a good knowledge about DID, which makes it even more damaging that overall the population doubts and it says that DID isn't even a real disorder. And the problematic thing is that there's therapists that even share this belief on social media, and this is extremely unprofessional. It goes against what the research is saying. And I know that some of these therapists say, oh, you can use research to prove whatever you want. But the thing is, they're not looking to even look through the research and talk about it in their page then. Okay, then let's talk about it. Let's talk about what is actually the evidence for the fact that DID actually exists. Because I'm watching certain therapists like Dr. Todd Grande, and he's saying that, scientific method is to try to disprove something. Okay, he is literally doing against the scientific method because he doesn't, in his videos, ever try to disprove his ideas or show any evidence for them on that matter. And just because someone is a therapist doesn't mean that they're necessarily an expert at a certain disorder. Dissociative identity disorder is a very complex and confusing thing, and there are experts out there, and I think that more of those experts should be listened to instead of just random wackos on the internet who don't necessarily do the research that they should or back it up with the evidence that they should when they're talking about a topic. And I think it's especially interesting that they tend to pick on people who are, disjointed or confusing when they're discussing their DID. Just because someone doesn't know what DID is and doesn't know the details of it doesn't mean that they don't have it. And I think that actually makes it more likely that they do have it, because for me necessarily, I don't know everything about DID. I've been diagnosed with it. I didn't know about it before I was diagnosed. That makes it more of a chance that I actually have it. Whereas that one account dissociated, which he seems like, oh, she's more articulate, she's more likely to actually have it, or they're more likely to actually have it. I'm pretty sure they actually admitted they don't. So you can't really tell how someone is by how they're speaking on a camera. And the fact is, if someone's more dissociated, they're more likely to be more confusing on the camera, to be contradicting themselves, to be going back and changing stuff and deleting stuff and going back on their word, because that is part of a symptom about DID. So if we are necessarily taking the symptoms of DID and saying, oh, this is proof that this person doesn't have it, that's kind of shit, bad job as a therapist, in my opinion. So I'm going to also talk about being doubted and the feeling that it can make trauma survivors go through. So a lot of trauma survivors, especially survivors of childhood trauma and childhood sexual abuse, have the experience of being doubted when they try to share what they've been through. And for us as adults, we often don't even have the ability to trust people in order to think, oh, we'll actually be accepted for who we are. So when we share something as personal as a diagnosis, which has probably taken a very, very long time, seeing multiple therapists in order to get, and then people are doubting that this disorder is even real, despite evidence backed up by an actual therapist who's an expert in the field of CPTSD and childhood trauma, this is going to make a trauma survivor feel extremely hopeless, unseen, unheard, helpless, and learn hopelessness and even suicidal. So it can be extremely damaging to doubt someone's diagnosis or the fact that an entire disorder is fake, especially if you haven't done the research in order to back it up. If you have done the research in order to back it up, I would say talking to that person first and asking them about their therapist, where they met their therapist, and asking them for something as simple as a validation about the fact that they have the therapist website, or correspondence between them and their therapist would be enough to prove the fact that someone has been speaking with an expert that's higher than you. Because I don't care if you have a bachelor's degree in psychology, you don't know enough to be able to diagnose someone or validate or not doubt their diagnosis. People are very good at hiding things, or the version of someone that you see on the surface is only, the mask that they have to present to the world. And not everyone is even in control of how that mask comes across. And in DID, there is a lack of control in, our parts being perceived as someone different than who we want to be perceived as. That's something that's very triggering for a lot of people with DID and embarrassing. So if their part comes forward and tells you something about themselves, the worst thing that you can do is to tell them that they're a liar. The best thing that you can do is to ask them the qualifications of their therapist. If you're really, really thinking that this is someone who you might want to ask questions about, because yes, DID is very serious and it's very important to definitely have a diagnosis. It's not something that you can self-diagnose. I do know people who have self-diagnosed, but they've done a lot of research in psychology, and I'm not recommending anyone to do that necessarily on their own. If you suspect you have DID, you should definitely go and see a therapist and who's a specialist in dissociative disorders and CPTSD and can diagnose you. But once someone is diagnosed, it doesn't make sense to doubt a diagnosis or a disorder that's been given to them by a medical professional, a PhD, or an MD, which is way over your pay grade for anyone who's doing that. And even if you are a PhD yourself, unless you spent your entire career studying dissociative identity disorder and you know this person in real life, you don't have the ability to change or doubt their diagnosis. And in fact, picking on specific individuals in order to question their diagnosis is against the goal of a therapist or a doctor, which should be to help and not harm. And why the hell would you take a platform that you have to help people and use it to call out specific people by name, doubt their diagnosis, and make a fool of them on the internet? Unless that person is your patient and has come to you directly and has asked you to share their information and signed off on an agreement. Because may I remind you that therapists have a patient-client agreement, so therapists can't even share their own patient information on YouTube or other social media networks. they definitely should not be making videos about questioning the diagnosis of other people or diagnoses in general. And to follow up on this, there are many professionals who are misinformed in this area. For example, when I was in college, I didn't think dissociative identity disorder was real. At the time, I had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I'd been on a series of medications for many years. I've tried every medication for it, and nothing was working. It was making me very suicidal and manic, which I hadn't been previously. I'd been previously experiencing anxiety, confusion, loss of memory, and a difficulty sleeping, and a difficulty making friends and fitting in college, which is what I went to the college center for. So I'll follow up and talk about this in another video about the fact that the college center misdiagnosed me with bipolar disorder. It took me many years to get the proper diagnosis, but in the meanwhile, I studied psychology and neuroscience at my college, and I learned in a class about human anthropology and psychology that dissociative identity disorder was a made-up disorder, which was made up in the 70s and the 60s by therapists who were using hypnosis and psychedelics and all these other sorts of weird hypnosis techniques and part of the satanic panic, and that basically dissociative identity disorder is not even a real disorder. And so I spent years thinking this is not even real. And I never expected that I had dissociative identity disorder myself, but I was having very difficulty time functioning. I had to go to the mental hospital over 8 times. Many times I got kicked out of places that I didn't want to be. I ended up having to take semesters off of college and drop out of classes. I lost a lot of friendships. I lost a lot of opportunities and places where I lived until I finally was able to meet the therapist that I have now and was finally given the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. And it took me a very long time to even believe him. Even still, parts of me don't believe him because of what I was taught in college. And I'm kind of a no-go in certain ways, and I wanted to expect that my education, which was a very good college, almost an Ivy League education and an all-women's college, was sufficient to teach me about what mental health disorders are real versus not real. Yet, I never learned about dissociative identity disorder besides learning that it's fake, fabricated, and that stuck with me. But now, meeting a therapist which knows about it, looking at the data, looking at the studies, which I'll try to either link in this video or make a separate video about, it's easy to see that all of the data supports the fact that people do just have dissociative identity disorder. And to have certain therapists say, even saying that the rate of people that have it is not as high as we think, okay, that might be true, that might not be true. But the thing is, unless you can show the data to support that, it's just a theorizing thing. It's worse than, people collecting multiple years of data on this topic and giving theories about what the prevalence is of dissociative identity disorders. Because these statistics are not just fabricated, they're, figured out by peer-reviewed studies, meta-analyses, and able to using statistics to figure out how to weigh different studies, but based on the credibility, the replicability, and the amount of participants, the many types of regression reform. There are many factors that are taken into account before giving out these statistics. And for a therapist to just come on YouTube and say, no, in my opinion, that is not true. You're one therapist going against tons of neuroscientists and therapists who are the experts in the field. So you're gonna have to give a little bit more data than that to prove your point. And the fact that that person will speak on something that they're completely uneducated on is actually a negative sign for their channel, that there's probably more things that are misleading in their channel. And I would suggest that viewers, take a second look at when they see someone say something so harmful for a whole community of people that are already, very harmed as childhood trauma survivors, and we're just willing to spew it out on the internet without actually doing the work to look into the data. And then yet we'll still shame people for saying, oh, but she hasn't done, at least she has includes a few studies and stuff. Okay, you also need to include studies as a PhD. If anything, you're more responsible for, including valid studies and including valid data as a PhD versus someone who's a case study. And I would say that it's actually good for people who are case studies, who actually have been diagnosed with certain disorders, to share their disorder, even if they later receive a different diagnosis. And even for people who are questioning their diagnosis and haven't received a diagnosis, you should still share videos. You should definitely explain that, like, you haven't received a diagnosis, or you're trying to self-diagnose, in the process of trying to get a real diagnosis, and that, nothing of this should be taken seriously. But these types of videos are the source of where we should be getting the information for clinicians to then use to understand these people better, understand the community, understand what the needs are, and understand different presentations of different disorders. So when I see something like this, yes, it's very difficult to differentiate between DID, OSDD, BPD, and just a video. That's why it's up to the therapist to do it. But it's interesting, definitely, to watch someone share their unfiltered experience and unfiltered perspective on YouTube. It's definitely a lot more interesting than hearing a expert or therapist spewing out opinions that are not backed up in data, other than their own personal bias. So that's just my opinion on the topic. I think that everyone who has gone through mental health struggles and mental health problems and trauma as a child has the right to tell and share their story and their diagnosis, even if they're not sure about it, even if it changes over time. Because 1, it can be very therapeutic to share your story. 2, sharing your story and your process of learning who you are and coming to know who you are can help other people understand what you've been through. For example, I never had bipolar disorder, but by the process of thinking I had bipolar disorder, I learned a lot about bipolar disorder, and I was able to, destigmatize mental health in general by, when I was in college, sharing the fact that I think I have bipolar disorder, I need accommodations to some of my professors, when in reality it ended up being dissociative identity disorder. It's still good that I shared my experience back then instead of staying suppressed, because loneliness is one of the biggest causes of suicide in people with mental health conditions. Loneliness, isolation, and feeling like a burden. And when you're telling someone that just by sharing who they are, or who they think they are, or who they've been told that they are, they're now a burden and a detriment on society and are dangerous and should stop talking, this is extremely damaging to that person's self-esteem and their chance at survival. You don't have to be a psychologist to know that people with mental health conditions like this, serious mental health conditions of any type, are at risk of suicide. And in this day and age, I don't think it's responsible for anyone, but especially a mental health professional, to come online and say things that encourage and support someone committing suicide, such as doubting what their diagnosis is, which directly isolates that person from an entire community which they could have been getting support from, and ostracizes them and puts them open to bullying and harassment for people calling them liars. And the thing is, many mental health conditions, such as borderline personality disorder, such as narcissistic personality disorder, such as antisocial personality disorder, are on the same spectrum as dissociative identity disorder, which means that people who have that are less dissociated than someone who has dissociative identity disorder, but they do still have different self states, which will result as a different, state coming forward as a dissociation. If that person is told they have dissociative identity disorder or comes to that conclusion, I don't think we should ostracize them and then later prevent them from receiving the help that they need that might help them, even if it's not their correct diagnosis. And yes, dissociative identity disorder is very different and more extreme than some of these other conditions, but I don't want to stop these people from getting help that they need. And they can often benefit as well from internalized family system, which is the treatment for dissociative identity disorder. So for anyone who comes forward to me and tells me that from now on and tells me that they think they have dissociative identity disorder, I might encourage them to follow up with a therapist who knows about internal family systems, knows about childhood trauma, CPTSD, and knows about dissociation. Because no matter what they have, if they're experiencing dissociation, that's real, it's debilitating, and we need to stop pathologizing different disorders or saying one is different than the other when anyone who is struggling with a mental health condition deserves the help that they need. There's no reason to pathologize DID in particular. There's no reason to pathologize other disorders like personality disorders either. And there's no reason that therapists need to come on here and spread stigma that can literally cause vulnerable populations who are already suicidal to follow through with suicide. So that's just my opinion on this topic. and I'm going to post this, and I'll probably post a follow-up as well later, and I can provide some sources citing evidence for DAD, and probably break down some therapist videos who are doubting it and talk about why specifically their science is so wrong, and methods in general. Bye.